Okay, I'm going to get underway. As I've said before, we are live streaming this. We're going to have people coming in as we go. But I'd like to welcome you to this evening. My name is David Jones. I'm president of the Community Service Society, and we're really pleased to host this panel. For 172 years, CSS has worked to raise the floor for all New Yorkers by advocating for what people need to live, such as housing, health care, and living wage work. And we do this through research into core issues around poverty and providing policies that ensure full participation and active political participation. CSS inaugurated the Color Line in the 21st Century series last year to provide a forum for a discussion of the wide-ranging effects of institutional racism and economic marginalization on communities of color. Let me digress by saying that as a 10-year-old, my grandfather, who was a lieutenant for Marcus Garvey, used to have me in shorts and a bow tie going with him around Bed-Stuy, handing out his leaflet, which was an early form of blogging, which was called Footnotes. He was a podiatrist. And it was all about the anti-lynching movement and what had to be done for economic improvement. And it somehow feels we're coming back to some of the basic things that my grandfather was working on and my father after him. Obviously, the forces that we're looking at hit all aspects of our work. The mass incarceration problem and resulting poverty and exclusion for generations of children and families. The Color Line series was conceived by Kim Westcott. Kim, you have to sit and wave. Associate Counsel. So she drove us to do the right thing. She's in CSS's legal department and an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia School of Social Work, which CSS founded. We should mention that. And I want to acknowledge Kim's work and efforts to bring together compelling speakers to address relevant topics on this issue. These discussions could not be more relevant today. The challenges are enormous, calling into questions the very basic understanding of a democratic society, particularly in the days of Trump. From the promise of evisceration of health care, which our constituencies are most dependent upon, voter suppression, which is now being given license, the defunding of public housing, to a renewed war, selective war on drugs, which is targeted towards black and brown communities. These are extraordinary times, and that's why we thought it was appropriate, at Kim's urging, to have a revival of a discussion, at least, of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign of '68. With the help of our distinguished panel, we hope to have a better understanding what's needed to support a new movement across movements, labor, faith, and the community. Before I introduce anyone else, I have to introduce our honorary life trustee, Mayor David Dinkins. I can say that David is important, obviously, for a family connection, for his work with CSS, but also I remember being a very young bureaucrat, and I think I was temporarily fired. And it was true, of course, I deserved it, but essentially David was one of the few people who would consult, and he did that for a generation of black leadership, and I really think we want to recognize personally what you did for us. So it's now my profound pleasure to introduce our moderator. He is award-winning journalist, author, and co-host of the radio show Democracy Now! For those of us who follow his illustrious journalism career over the years, his columns in the Daily News were must-reads and the embodiment of speaking truth to power. Juan Gonzalez, a friend to many of us on all levels. Thank you, Juan.
Well, thank you and good evening, and I'm humbled to be in the presence of my favorite mayor, David Dinkins, and recognizing that one of his junior staff people is now, one of his former junior staff members is now the mayor of New York, and continuing in his footsteps. Before I introduce the panel, I want to tell you a story. 50 years ago, or nearly 50 years ago, when the original Poor People's Campaign was touched off, I was a senior at Columbia College, first person in my family ever to go to college on a full scholarship at Columbia, and the assassination of Martin Luther King occurred just before my graduation on April 4th. Clearly, not only the Harlem community, but cities across America erupted in the greatest wave of civil disturbances in the history of the country. I think it was 100 cities in a week erupted in civil disturbances. And I remember the front page of the New York Times that week with a picture of federal troops that had been called out to surround the Capitol, to protect the Capitol against the insurrections that were occurring in Washington, D.C. And so that was the period in which we went into, we were supposed to graduate. We ended up occupying a bunch of buildings at Columbia University in that spring of '68. Some of the people that participated, fellow students of mine, you'd be surprised to know about today. Eric Foner, the great historian, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian of Reconstruction, was part of that strike. Mark Mason, the chair of African American Studies at Fordham University, was part of that strike. Mike Wallace, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian of the city of New York, of Gotham, the author of Gotham. Minnie Nye, who is now one of the preeminent immigrant historians at Columbia University, was part of that strike. Ralph Metcalf Jr., the son of Ralph Metcalf Sr., the famous judge and congressman from Chicago. Bill Soles, who became the chairman of African American Studies at Seton Hall University. Ray Brown Jr., the son of the famous civil rights lawyer from New Jersey, Ray Brown Sr. These were all students who participated in that strike in 1968, all of us feeling that we could not continue our careers or our hopes of a career in a situation where a nation was heading into what appeared to be racial civil war and fighting against the Vietnam War as well. A lot has changed in 50 years, and I'm hoping that we can have a discussion now among this great group of panelists about what the possibilities are for resurrecting the sentiment and the ideas of the Poor People's Campaign of Martin Luther King in 1968, now that the great Reverend William Barber has called for a revival of that effort. So the panelists that we're going to be discussing, and you have their biographies, in your booklets are the Reverend Dr. James Forbes, Senior Minister Emeritus of Riverside Church, Marvin Holland, the Legislative and Political Director of TWU Local 100, and Mark Winston Griffith. Well, I met Mark 10 years ago, and he was over at NEDAP, and we were beginning to understand the crisis that was occurring in New York and other cities over the subprime mortgage debacle, and Mark was the first one who said, along with his colleague Sarah, who said to me, look at where all of these foreclosures are occurring. And when they did a map of the foreclosures in New York City, it dovetailed exactly with the African American and Latino communities of New York City. The foreclosure crisis was specifically directed at Central Brooklyn, at Southeast Queens, at the East Bronx and the South Bronx, and they were the first ones to uncover the reality that the subprime crisis was directed specifically at the African American and Latino communities of New York City. So I'd like to begin with our elder, Reverend Forbes. If you could talk to us about the original Poor People's Campaign, your recollections of its impact on American society, on the African American and Latino activists of that time, and your sense of its importance in history.
Yes. My first words, and I think I should sound myself first.
Let me make sure it's working. Is it going up?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
The first thing I'd like to say is that
The day Dr. King was assassinated, I was traveling across Marshall Street Bridge in Richmond, Virginia, on the way to the Medical College of Virginia, where I was doing chaplaincy work. The news came midway the bridge. Tears came. I was not sure I could see clearly to get across that bridge. So deeply touched was I. I turned into the parking lot, and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, and I said, "Martin, you shall not have died in vain," which was in a sense a pledge that the work that had been interrupted would not be stilled, or that his voice would not be silenced, or that his dream would not be obliterated. Well, here we are now on the verge of 50 years later, and I have to ask myself, did I keep the promise that I made that day? Well, at least last year, starting with April the 4th, Dr. Baba and I were a part of what they call the moral revival, for moral high ground, for transformation of the values in the nation. And we traveled many of the states of the South, at least 20-some states together, preaching and listening to the cries of the people. One thing emerged is that many of us who are fairly well off have no idea the condition under which people struggle when they are close to that poverty line or below. So then, as we were completing our work during that time, 2015 through 16 and to 17, the question, now that we've done the moral revival, what are we going to do next? Well, I thought that we should probably simply look forward to doing an audit to parallel the Kerner Commission report, which also was in 68. That was what I thought we should do. My colleague, Dr. Baba, said, I think we really ought to take up the unfinished work of Dr. King, and we should set forward again the agenda of a poor people's campaign in this nation. My initial response was, no, man, because neither of the campaigns, Democratic or Republican, spent any time really on the issue of poverty. And I've always tried to be a sort of principled pragmatic. I know that the issue is important, but not now, not given the radical disinterest and neglect of the poor. It's hard enough to get the fight for 15 to get some traction. Why are we going to do it? So my first reaction was, the Poor People's Campaign is a good idea, but America is not, even now, 50 years later, ready. That's not the question you asked me. You asked me, what about it then? Dr. King, known originally for his work on the color line, had come past the color line, past the issue of war in his speech to End Silence, and had finally come to recognize you can't talk about color unless you're going to talk about economic conditions. Indeed, he made it clear that you can talk about change, but if you're going to deal with the giants, you must recognize that they are racism, materialism, and militarism. So, the Poor People's Campaign was as inconvenient then as it is now. Mm-hmm. Because, okay, Martin, you survived talking about race. You survived talking about the war. But don't mess with these people's money. And his decision was, no, we will gather in Washington, not just black people, but poor people from all across the country, whether they are black or brown, or whether they are Appalachian whites. We're going to do this thing because America cannot continue to spend all of this money on war and expect to sustain its commitment to being a just society. So he was concerned. So my recollection, so that I can not take too long in response to your question,
that's fine, we have time.
Yes, is that Dr. King was convinced that until there was a restructuring of our society, such that it led to redistribution of resources, such that it led to a significant narrowing of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, we actually cannot make progress. We are beginning to see the decline of the possibility of a truly democratic society. And he had convinced us that it was true, and we were ready to go with him to tie up 14th Street Bridge, to go to the halls of Congress, to do whatever was necessary to say the time has come to end the grand hypocrisy of being a just society, given the economic dispossession, disparity, and the diminishment of the prospect of meaningful existence for most of the people in the world. So that's what it was like then, and it is similar now. And I think you suggested, what do I think maybe the prospect is for trying to get around to it? Maybe you hadn't asked that before, but I'll be ready to respond when you get to that.
Well, the interesting thing is that from about 1968 to about 1973, there was actually some economic progress in the society. By all of the accounts, the decline, the new wealth gap, the increase in wealth gap began after 1973, and we've been in a downward spiral ever since. So that some of the information reported in Kim's report, we're now in a situation where 24% of African Americans are in poverty, 21% of Hispanics, 11% of Asian Americans, and 9% of whites. The median household income was $55,000 per capita in the United States, and it's now down to, the per capita income in the United States was $29,000. The disparities in wealth keep growing in New York City. The share of total income, now this is astounding, the share of total income received by the filers in the top 1% of New York City was 40.5%. At the other end of the income distribution, the share of total income received by tax filers in the bottom half in 2014 was 5.6%. So the top 1% got 40% of the income, and the bottom half got 5% of the income. This is an astounding growth in wealth inequality, which is part of the reason why de Blasio was elected, why Bill Peduto was elected in Pittsburgh, why Betsy Hodges was elected in Minneapolis, Martin Walsh in Boston. All of these cities, people are astounded that wealth inequality has grown in the United States rather than shrink. And I'm wondering, Mark, as a younger generation fighting the same fights. What you see in terms of income inequality in Brooklyn and other parts of New York City, and the resonance, the importance of the Poor People's Campaign being resurrected or resuscitated in our time.
Sure. So thank you. And I have to chuckle at being called a young person. I think that says more about us than does about me. But I first want just to acknowledge sort of how I come full circle in this conversation, in the sense that I used to work for CSS back in the early 90s, 90, 91, sometime around then, in the political development department, which was really trying to sort of take advantage of a lot of the changes that were going on in New York City with reapportionment and redistricting, and really restructuring city government in many ways. And what we have today in terms of 51 city council people and, getting rid of the Board of Estimate and all those things sort of, was happening around then. The other thing I want to just acknowledge that Reverend Forbes mentioned Dr. Reverend Barber, and I actually met Billy Barber. Actually, in 1984, I was a college student and went to the South, to North Carolina, to do some voter registration. And I got there, and they didn't have any housing for us, so I slept on the floor of an office for the first couple of weeks. And Billy Barber, who was at North Carolina Central at the time, saw me and my colleague and helped us get housing, and we were really close friends through the rest of the summer. I'm not sure he would remember me these days. It's been a minute. It's been all those years, but I just want to comment on coming full circle. So, is a Poor People's Campaign possible? I mean, I'm going to make some sort of impressionistic remarks, and hopefully that will result in something that is intelligible. But I think a good starting point is, one, where I am. What is I do? I organize in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. I run something called the Brooklyn Movement Center, which is a Black-led, multi-issue community organizing group, direct action, which is really just trying to build power for people who live Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, and the surrounding area, to focus on local issues and connect those local issues and what low and moderate income people are experiencing on a local level, and connect them to larger citywide, regional, and national campaigns to create policy change and other forms of meaningful change in people's lives. So I've been doing that for a few years. I've been based in Central Brooklyn for a really long time. So I want to start there, as well as the Movement for Black Lives, which is an umbrella sort of more generic name that came after the Black Lives Matter movement started. There now is an organization called Movement for Black Lives, but it really corresponds to something more broad, which I think is trying to capture while I'm part of it, most of the energy is coming from people who are 10, 20, 30 years younger than me. And what I've been impressed with is that it has centered community organizing in a way that I have not seen in a popular fashion among Black communities in a really long time. Sort of understanding and respecting the art and science of community organizing. And when I say that, meaning that respecting democracy, understanding that this is not a top-down process, that everyone has a voice and everyone should be contributing. And so I think that's extremely important. And I think it gives us some fertile ground with which to build a mass movement. At the same time, there's some challenges. So for instance, I do community organizing, as I said, in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. And we're building power and building agency for local people. And one of the big ironies there is that because of gentrification, the very base of Black folks that we're trying to build are vaporizing before us. And as Juan mentioned earlier, when we talk about the foreclosure crisis, that played a very key role in starting displacement and having people lose equity on a large scale from their homes. And so while we're trying to organize mostly black folks there, so much of the political energy is actually coming from middle-class folks, from dominantly white folks who are moving into the neighborhood. And so we've had to create a whole language around solidarity and what it means to work across these racial lines. But in the meantime, it's taking up a lot of air out of the room in terms of organizing among low and moderate income people. And it's becoming more of a struggle for us to do that work. I think it's also, and so even in this moment where we've seen renewed energy after the Trump election, a lot of that energy is not actually coming from low and moderate income black neighborhoods. It's coming from middle class black folks. It's coming from middle class folks elsewhere. But there's so much more that has to be done in terms of building leadership at a low and moderate income level. So I think that what's important to recognize is that...
Why do you think that is? Why do you, is it that people are, in some of the communities are so beaten down by the fact that they now have to hold down 2 and 3 jobs, that they doubled up or tripled up in housing because they can't afford to pay the existing cost of housing? Why is there, are you getting a sense that it's even harder now to organize the African American, Latino, or the poor communities in various neighborhoods of the city?
Because I think you're seeing fracturing across racial lines, class lines, all sorts of identity lines.
There's no women up there. Let's try that. We're running the household.
I didn't organize it. I'm just
Rain cloud when there's no women on the panel.
I hear you loud and clear. I hear you.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I agree with you totally. So yes, so I think all these fractures exist, and I think what you had 60s and 70s and 80s, when you had a black sort of political class that rose, and I think in many ways left low and moderate income people behind, and middle class black folks becoming spokespersons and leaders, and really not doing enough to develop leadership across class lines. And I think, again, in general, I think there's a fracturing that's going on. So if we're talking about a poor people's movement, we're talking about something that has to work on a neighborhood basis with clergy, with labor, and I have to say that I don't see those alliances happening on a grassroots level, and they are happening to some extent on a national level, but it's not being done, I think, in a form where black folks are in the forefront. I'll just say one last thing and step off. And that is, in the last year, we've seen some examples of movement building that has tried to reach across these fissures, these fractures. And I think it gives us 2 examples of how it can be done. So you had the Women's March in Washington, which in many ways was originally being led mostly by white women. And there was a critique, there was sort of like a knocking down of the door, and it shifted, and you had women of color then taking on leadership. Unfortunately, I don't think that translated into the rank and file folks who were at the march. I don't think it didn't translate enough into that march being enough of women of color, and I know a lot of women of color.
It was worse before that. It was white women with transgender men and men in dresses. So it was only white women and really other men. At least we had women at this point.
Well, I'll push back on your definitions there, because I think the movement for Black Lives, what also distinguishes us is that it's intersectional, and not only we broaden our definitions of gender, place, and their gender nonconforming and transgender people whose humanity has been recognized. I think in many ways through. Can I speak?
Then there's a problem.
We'll have an opportunity for folks in the audience to raise questions.
Women, period. There's no women, and men cannot speak for women. I don't care what it is. Women need to speak for themselves. And transgender do not equal that. I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll have an opportunity to ask more questions and comments from the audience, but let's give the speaker some courtesy.
My last point is that what you saw on the People's Climate March, I think, was very different, in the sense that the same thing happened. I think there was led by white environmental groups, and then people of color stepped in and said, "Hey, this is really affecting neighborhoods and communities of color across the country, and we need to be a big part of this." And then I think that in that instance, people of color became true stakeholders in that movement. I think that we have a long way to go in terms of people of color being among the ranks of people who are showing up at the climate march. But I think that there you saw labor, you saw clergy, you saw environmental groups, you saw traditional Black and Latino and Asian groups who actually came together, and where people of color actually were in a leadership role in a meaningful way.
I want to ask Marvin Holland. The labor movement has played a critical role back in the original civil rights movement, as 1199 used to be called Martin Luther King's favorite union. It's always the United Auto Workers, District 65. All of these unions played critical roles helping to finance and provide organizers for the civil rights movement. The state of labor today in New York City and around the country, and its ability to continue to play the role that it's played in the past in terms of progressive movements and a revival of the Poor People's Campaign?
Before I say anything, I want to just say a lot of times you hear about distinguished panels, but being on a panel with Mark and Reverend Forbes and having Reverend Dinkins here, Mayor Dinkins, it's truly a distinguished panel, and don't know quite how I ended up on here. But the answer to your question, I don't think labor has a choice at this point in time, but to re-engage with the community and the civil rights groups, etc. And the reason I say that is that the election of Trump, there was a split already going in with the labor movement. As most people know, my union went with Bernie, many unions went with Hillary, but I think there was a clear split inside of the labor movement, not so much from the union leadership, but from rank and file. And so I think it's time for labor to take a step back and look at what the rank and file is saying. And I think if you go on the streets, I spend a lot of time on the streets talking to people, and one thing people want to see is the unions engaged in the community. And I think to some of the points Mark was making, I think you're going to see going forward a much different labor movement, particularly here in New York City. I just left before I came here. I was at a meeting with 1199, with representatives from 1199, and what they were talking about was really redoing the healthcare system in Central Brooklyn. We know there's been problems with the hospitals in Central Brooklyn. They're losing $350 million a year. And so what we were talking about was, what they were talking about was redoing the way healthcare is dispensed in Central Brooklyn. But for the first time, people were wondering why is the Transit Workers Union working on this with them? Because how do we transport people in that situation if you're going to move healthcare facilities and stuff like that? So for the first time, I see labor in my time, and I've been a rank and file for 27 years and involved with the union the last 15 years or so. The first time I see labor sitting down with each other and bringing the community in the room and saying, how do we fix these problems? So I think going forward, it's of the utmost importance that labor plays a role in this Poor People's Campaign that everyone's talking about now.
Now we have a mayor now here in New York City, Bill de Blasio, who you could argue has actually moved forward in terms of helping to eliminate poverty right here in the city. I mean, if you look at the efforts at pre-K, a pre-K program that your average child care cost for a 4-year-old in this city today is $10,000 to $12,000 a year, and there's now 70,000 families that don't have to pay that money anymore because they have pre-K. There's 3 years of rent freezes, effectively, in New York City. The first time in the history of the city that rent stabilization costs have been kept to 0 or 1%. You've got paid sick leave for the first time. 500,000 people in New York City who before could not take a day off from work to care for a sick child now have the ability to have a week's worth of paid sick leave. You have the decree of the mayor to require all contractors from the city to at least pay $15 an hour, and which before you had thousands of people working for the city of New York or contractors who were being paid $7, $8, $10, $12 an hour. Now they are moving to $15 an hour. But this is only happening in New York City. It's not happening in other parts of the country. And I'm wondering how we can get a nationwide change in raising the economic level of those at the bottom of the society. And as de Blasio or other proponents have said, trickle up, not trickle down the economics of the country. I'm wondering, Reverend Barber, your sense of what's happening in New York City. Is it dramatic or not, or and what can be done to spread this kind of change on a nationwide level?
Well, Reverend Barber seems to have thought...
I'm sorry, Reverend Forbes. I'm sorry, Forbes.
Reverend Barber thought, and then I'll say...
I'll see you in a moment.
That he felt that you got to do whatever you're going to do, not anticipating that a national solution is going to bring the energy you need for the change. So he has felt that if you change the South, you're likely to begin to impact the whole nation. And he displays maps showing the degree to which the resistance to change has been stubborn in that area. If you change it there, maybe we've got some possibility. But the idea is that I see, for years, I suffered from being a preacher. And as a preacher, I was so idealistic that I just believed that folks were just good folks anyway and that they were going to do right because maybe we preach good about doing right. But it feels to me that the new reality is that if we are to see the change in places such as we have it in New York, such that, first of all, let's explain why it's possible in New York. I think it would have to have something to do with the quality of organizing of the many different people who are here, who are experiencing the conditions that make it possible to be politically astute in asking for change. Does that make sense? We're not doing it just because New York is a nice place. So in other places, if we can help people understand more clearly the degree to which their actions in the past have involved voting in ways that have been against their own interest. And so that Reverend Barber, in going around with the moral revival, has been attempting to just make people smart enough to know, look, folks, we're not asking you to be all godly, all righteous, just plain moral and have good self-interest. So that he's had training of pastors and lay leaders and in relationship to unions, just to say, once folks get the figuring, oh, yeah, that is not good for me. And then help them to see how to translate that new awareness into political savvy enough to begin to change the reality. So for me, I'm no longer hoping that we're going to stir up people on Sunday morning and get them involved. No, if we can inform them about the realities that impact their daily existence, and also show them the way in which political power can find a way to respond to that new awareness, then maybe we can get some change. So I'm expecting that New York has some of these differences. And Mark, to tell me that you were organizing, and that while you're organizing, gentrification is, in a sense, tampering with the sources of energy and ideology that once helped the other thing to happen. The whole question is, how do we get the newly, those people who are not occupying the same old space to be aware that they got the same old problem? In which case, Reverend Barber's perspective, that fusion politics, not that we like fusion, most of us want to do our thing by ourselves. It just doesn't make sense given the reality of today. So he has taken the approach, as in his Moral Monday movement, that folks, the good Lord has arranged that it's now possible to see that we're all in trouble together. And if we realize we're all in trouble together, it could be that some of us who've been in trouble longer will have a lot to teach other people about, okay, then let's get together and do something about it together. I think that's the general perspective in terms of the possibility for the poverty program to have success in these times.
Yeah, Mark, I want to ask you about the gentrification issue, because I was in Bushwick a few weeks ago, and I was astounded by how Bushwick has changed. And now, even East New York, where I grew up in the Cypress Hills projects in East New York, and how sections of East New York are changing. And it's not just New York City. Every major city in America is going through massive gentrification problems as African Americans and Latinos and the poor are being shunted off into the suburbs, not just into the outskirts of the city, into the suburbs. And the American city is being re-engineered along European lines, where the poor are way out in outward suburbs, nowhere near the center cities, whereas the wealthy are back in the major central city areas. How can that be stopped? And even when you have a progressive like Bill de Blasio, who's probably, aside from these continuing problems with policing problems, his other big problem is he really hasn't addressed the gentrification problem in a substantive way. I'm wondering how you think that can be dealt with.
You keep dominating the panels, I can guarantee it will never be stopped. Yes, for sure. You are contributing to the problem, and you need other people to speak in the game. You've been controlling for far too long, and you're lame.
Okay. All right, Mark?
Okay. Yeah, I wish I had an easy answer for that. I wish I had an answer, period, for that. It's something that has become almost like an existential threat to us. And, you know, I don't like to use language like this too loosely, but when you're in the throes of it, and when you're talking about a neighborhood like Central Brooklyn, where my family has been since the early 50s, it almost feels like ethnic cleansing.
That's what it is.
The way
that's exactly what it is.
The way we're being sort of disappeared, and so the only way I know how to combat it is by doing what we're doing now, which is organizing and getting people to recognize not only what the problem is, but where their political strength is and how you can fight back. So, for instance, you know, housing, which is at the center of this, bringing low and moderate income people together to make sure that there are affordable housing laws, and of course I don't want to get into it just on what affordable housing is, but something that preserves the ability for low and moderate income people to stay there. But it's on all levels. It's about how we recognize policing and what the role of the police there. Who are they there to protect? We do work around food sovereignty and food justice, and it's a conversation about food apartheid now, because we used to talk about food deserts and the fact that folks didn't have access to quality foods. Now there are quality foods in places like Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, but only certain people have access to it, can afford it, and it only seems sort of culturally delivered to certain people. So I don't have an easy answer to your question, only to say that it has to be done through organizing. It's not, no one's going to ride in on a white horse or black horse and save folks. We're going to have to save ourselves. We're going to have to fight back in the same way that I think that folks fought back in the 60s and 70s. And in some ways, sort of, what we have now is a testament to some of those victories, right? You have somewhat of a stable middle class there. You have civil society that's functioning. And now that you have a neighborhood that is so stable, it's now become ripe for other folks to come in. So, I think we have to speak the truth of what it is, and it's got to be a daily fight, and it's got to be done on all fronts.
Marvin, you're the legislative and the political director of TW Local 100. I wanted to ask you how your union sees the Trump presidency as affecting the survival of poor people in America. Some of us lived through Nixon, and we lived through Reagan, and then Bush 1 as well as Bush 2. Is there anything qualitatively different about what you're seeing now in terms of Trump and the new conservative grip now on Washington that is qualitatively different from some of these other right-wing presidents that we've had in the past?
Absolutely. The labor movement as a whole is, everyone's kind of bunkering down. We know what's coming down the turnpike. The fact that the Supreme Court is going to be extremely conservative now, and right, the labor movement thinks right to work could very well be the law of the land. And that's why I said earlier, we have no choice but to join with the community now and the clergy. Our very survival is at stake, and there's no doubt that the labor movement thinks that this is not business as usual with Donald Trump, and it doesn't matter with all the problems he's having if Pence comes in or whatever. Our very survival is at stake here. When they started attacking the public sector unions in Wisconsin, what a lot of people weren't paying attention to, those were public sector unions. Most of the public sector unions are what's left of the labor movement. The density of the private sector is well below 10% now. But those are also mostly, to the young lady's point who was here earlier, those are mostly women of color and people of color in those public sector unions that were attacked. So when they break up that last bastion of the trade union movement, which this administration and the Republican, the right wing in general wants to do, labor understands that they're in serious trouble here and that they have to do some things different.
And when you say you see what's coming down the pike, what are the main things that you're looking at that you're expecting to come down?
We escaped Friedrichs, the case in the Supreme Court that would have taken away dues checkoff, which a lot of, particularly in the public sector, we depend on. And there's another case coming down.
But you escaped that only because the Supreme Court was 4-4.
Right. And now those cases, and what they learned was, what people on the right learned was to really race these cases to the Supreme Court. So it wasn't even, they didn't even care when Friedrichs got voted down or it got knotted up 4-4. What they began to change their tactics and saying, we just got to get these cases in front of the Supreme Court and we could win them once we have a more conservative Supreme Court, which they have now.
And the National Labor Relations Board as well.
The National Relations Board already. So, I mean, I've never seen, like I said earlier, my time in the labor movement where the discussions are totally different now inside those rooms. Like, people understand that we have to do things differently for our very survival. And that's why I would suggest to particularly people like Mark who are in organizing that this is the time to really build those alliances that you've been talking about, labor doing for a long time. I think they're ripe and they're listening now. They have no choice.
Well, and can I say something? I do think that this is a special moment. So, and I think that it's going to be important for labor to really think more broadly about what its self-interests are, because I think labor traditionally has looked inward and said, okay, what is best for our rank and file? And no matter sort of what the larger implications are, that's what we're going to follow. So, case in point, and I was talking to Mark Willis about this earlier. I'm working on the start of a beginning of a campaign, building a broad coalition around a progressive 21st century jobs and infrastructure bill that would be counter to what we see Trump preparing, which is going to be called jobs and infrastructure, but it's really going to be the privatization of our roads and bridges. We don't know what kinds of jobs are going to be created, and I'm sure there's going to be a huge, gift to the fossil fuel industry as well. And we're trying to create this progressive base, and the big challenge is where is labor going to stand on this? Because we're going to need labor to stand with us in this progressive version of what real jobs and infrastructure are. And what we already understand is that, the buildings and trades and others who, see some potential skin in there for them, already indicating that they'll go along with what Trump might be proposing. And without sort of seeing the larger picture, and without seeing how their best interests might, while their immediate self-interest may, this bright, shiny thing might be something they gravitate toward, but they're going to have to somehow step back and be in alliance with a broader movement that is trying to counter what he's trying to do.
In line with that, I'd like to ask Reverend Forbes about the potential divisions in the faith community, especially in light of the appointment of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. I mean, to me, it was one of the most stunning appointments of the Trump administration, because now the faith community is going to have to be dealing with fissures within its own ranks over the question that DeVos is going to increasingly want to do vouchers for education and basically dismantle the public education system. For instance, the Catholic Church, which is always on issues of poverty, being very outspoken, is also wants to get those vouchers to maintain their Catholic schools. And so I'm wondering if there's a discussion or debate among faith leaders about what is going to be happening with public education under a Trump administration.
Well, am I still on?
Yes.
Let me say that before I mention the response to you, this question about labor now having to work more closely with community, but you're raising the question about labor is always interested in labor because labor thinks labor is good for all of us. But you have a different perspective in terms of, so if the prospect looks like, oh, we got jobs and infrastructure and look like that might be pretty good, that ought to be good news for unions. But these guys are saying, no, it could be that you are being ensnared into something that is immediately beautiful, but has a long-term prospect of really diminishing your power. So my response here is, it feels to me like guys that think like you have a bigger job of crying loudly with better analysis to combat the proclivity of guys that are more likely to think traditionally as to what's going to be beneficial. And that's I mentioned that because that's the same answer
Right.
that I'm giving to the questions coming up.
Mhm.
That is to say, these churches have always loved to have a chance to get some money to help their nursery school. And then we're going to have the charter school, and people can tell them this is going to be good for you. The people who are advocates for public education have the responsibility of saying, oh, it's wonderful to have freedom of choice, either public schools or charter. But we are going to insist on a formula. Now, whatever you're going to do for charter, we've got to have evidences that it is not at the expense of public school education. And we can say that, but the energy is in the direction under the new Secretary of Education of charter. So it feels to me like these are days in which people who have an alternative narrative, that they ought to be given much encouragement and much political support and consultation, because we got the bigger job. And in other words, we who see an alternative to the way the Trump direction is going, we've got a job with ourselves, as well with our traditional allies, as well as with those who have been adversarial to us before. So, so that's my sense. Religious organizations have always felt like they wanted to be blessed so they could bless their people. And therefore they have been vulnerable to folks that come along and say, we're going to help you bless your people. But the sophistication of knowing what's a short-term blessing plus a more strategic long-range blessing cries out for a lot of training and teaching and sophisticated organizing, so we don't get into the okie-doke as they talk about.
And can I say this? I think one of the challenges too that we have to acknowledge is that labor and churches and faith-based organizations, they've got their own issues they're dealing with, right? The thinning of their ranks and the assault, particularly with labor, the assault from governments, from our federal government, but just the assault on the idea of the labor movement in general, in particular, is under attack. And so they're struggling with how they keep their own institutions open, and that sort of focuses you inward. And I think that's going to be a big challenge, because I know for me, as an organizer in Central Brooklyn, I look at our allied organizations, and very, very few of them are churches, very few of them are labor, and we've talked about this before, and I'm not here to beat up on those institutions, but recognizing that they're struggling, and yet something's going to have to turn around where they're going to have to start looking outward. I don't know how that happens.
Sure. Because one of the things that's happening, as I said, I'm working with 1199 and other unions in Central Brooklyn, and this is to your point, one of the things that our members, we did a survey, and what our members fear the most is that they're going to be priced out. And so this idea of people being priced out of a neighborhood is affecting everybody, and I think it causes people not to trust. I think it causes even our members to say, well, what's the union doing if I'm being priced out of a market? And that's why I say labor is looking at things different now. That we have to look at a holistic approach to the community. And just on the idea of the trade unions, and also trade unions are not monolithic. You have the building trades, you have private sector and public sector, which I come out of. But one thing the building trades are really, if you look at the numbers of the building trade unions, they have more people of color now in their apprenticeship programs than they do the old guard. So I think there is a change taking place, but I think what has to happen that people have to really come together and sit down with a holistic approach to how we approach community.
I'd like to ask all the panelists about the issue of militarism. Dr. King always raised the issue that the continued spending on military, on wars overseas to conquer other countries diminished the ability of the nation itself to combat poverty within the nation. Here we're into the 17th year of the war in Afghanistan and continued American interventions in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Somalia. And I'm wondering what the discussion or the chance to raise these issues in our communities of what we are essentially creating a generation of young people who go into the military and are constantly involved in these wars around the country. What that does to the American psyche, what it does, because so many of the soldiers that come out of the military end up going into the police departments and into the FBI, to other law enforcement, to the Border Patrol, and they bring with them this culture of being constantly at war with the other.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering what you all think about this issue of raising our continued military interventions as part of the battle against poverty in America.
Well, it seems like my machine doesn't seem to be working so well. Okay, here we go.
I have to look at the mayor because Mayor Dinkins, see, I'm finding myself, and this is in response to your question, yes, I'm finding myself moving seriously into a conspiratorial mindset. My belief is that we are not so much wrestling, and you always have to correct me, we're not simply fighting Trump and Bannon and the Koch brothers, but we are fighting, it seems to me, a billionaires oligarchical cabal that is functioning without regard for nation states or ideology. So that this money club, and I ain't talking about $100,000, the billionaires club is capable, this was, I say conspiratorial. I don't know that there's been a meeting of the billionaires club on some yacht somewhere.
Yes, there has been. A long time ago.
Well, if there is a billionaires club, and if Putin is with 185 billion, the biggest of the billionaires, and the sub-billionaires are fascinated by the power and the charm, explaining why the presidency and the Russians are all in. What I'm really saying is, I think we're in bigger trouble than what's going to happen with the churches or the unions or the jobs and the infrastructure. Now, that's what I think. But if that's the case, and if Biden believing in the fourth turning that we just got to have a war, and they keep messing around with the head of North Korea, and the Chinese got to do that thing back. It feels to me that we are fighting a larger battle that should impact how we try to work ourselves with the lesser battles. The thing that's going to make us come together, black and white and Latinos and rich and middle class and all of us, is when we recognize that the threat against the climate, the threat with respect to nuclear warfare, the threat with respect to the destabilization of trade and economy and all of that, that we've got a common threat that's too strong for us to sit around and play tiddlywinks about, and therefore we should have more effective conversation about how deep are we into this mess, and what ways do we have a chance of interrupting the steady movement towards the further destabilization of our government and all of this stuff. My thinking, therefore, in response to your question, is militarism is more serious than it's ever been as we stand on the precipice of We don't know what that next phase is going to be, with ideologues who are daily trying to find how they can put the next war in place. Okay, so my sense is that a militaristic world, Dr. King says, cannot keep faith with the commitment to a humanizing agenda. So we have to find a way how to hear Dr. King all over again when he says, if America is to be on the right side of the world revolution, she must undergo a radical revolution of values. And the values include, obviously, racism and also materialism. But now back to the question, militarism. And all three of those giants have to be fought simultaneously. But if we can't fight them simultaneously, our analysis must look at all of them. And each one of us with particular passions about different things can go to work. But all of us had better be involved in it, or else we are in real trouble. And so if the conversation is about poverty, what happened to the Occupy Wall Street folks? They were looking at the inequities. My sense is that the real poverty issue, and this is why gentrification doesn't have to be so bad, or as Dr. Barber says, fusion politics need not be a loss to energy of the movement, is if the billionaire cabal has its way, the person who thinks she's middle class is going to be in the same plight that the person who knows that he or she is below the poverty line. I think that it's not just hocus pocus. I think there's a real reason why folks that never wanted to be in coalition with us need to be in coalition with us. So I guess my job is to try to help make a big enough sense of common threat to suggest the urgency of common analysis and programmatic response wherever we can, as quickly as we can, with as much energy and as force as we can. That's my sense on answer to that.
Anyone else just dropped the mic on that one, so.
The militarism question raises, because it's, when you look at young folks, sometimes that's the only way out of many of these communities is to join the military. I know back in 1982, when I graduated high school, there was nothing out there for me. Flash forward to 2017, there's even less out there for these people. So it creates an interesting dilemma, and I think Mark's idea of having some type of infrastructure plan to employ people is of the utmost importance. I'm just surprised that no one's really talking about how much the military budget is going up. Of all the things Trump has done, they don't really even talk about that. And as the Reverend said, we're in scary times.
I want to ask about drugs, because I have been astounded over the last few years as this enormous sympathy for the drug epidemic that has swept across the country. When I remember back in the 70s as heroin spread throughout the inner city, and all the talk was lock them up, send them away forever, these criminal drug addicts. And now suddenly, as more and more white Americans, as the heroin epidemic and the opioid epidemic has gone into New Hampshire and upstate New York and Southern Ohio, suddenly there are all these advertisements on radio and television about grappling with the problems that the young people are having with falling into drugs. I'm saying this is another heroin epidemic, but there's a completely different narrative. Mm-hmm. And suddenly now we get Jeff Sessions saying, "Oh, I'm gonna lock them all up anyway." He's trying to change this new narrative. And I'm wondering how you all are seeing this whole issue of drugs and the mass incarceration epidemic that it spawned, but now this new counter-narrative that has developed that it's a drug mental health problem and it's a drug medical problem that has to be dealt with.
What I'll say about that is, the great thing about working in Albany the last 5 or 6 years, you hear some very strange things come out of people's mouth. I'll put it like that. I was sitting in Senator Robach's office. For those of you who don't know Senator Robach, he's from Rochester. He grew up in Brooklyn. He lives in Rochester now, white Republican. We're there talking about some transportation issues, and we're finished with our conversation. He turns to me and he says, let me ask you a question. He said, how come now that the heroin problem is in the white community, the governor wants us to rush in and put all this money in the budget, and he said, I don't hear a thing coming out of the caucus, your brothers and sisters in the caucus are not saying a thing about this. He said, this is outrageous. He said, if I was on the other side of the fence, I would be saying, all these years you didn't do anything. But it was strange because it was coming from a white Republican sitting there next to me telling me this. So I think you're right. But I think the thing is, people don't like to touch the issue of race. Like a lot of times we beat around it. They don't want to say, a lot of people don't want to say, a lot of black people don't want to say, and Latinos don't want to say that the issue changes when other people are involved. And I don't really know what to say about that, except that it's clear that when one group of people is affected by something, it's treated differently.
Gentrification is another example of the race-supporting euphemisms that are in play.
Well, there's no doubt on gentrification. I wanted to ask in terms of going back to the school issue, Mark, the charter schools have obviously grown largely in the African American community. There's not that many, even though 42% of the children in New York City public schools are Latino, the charter schools have not had as big an impact on the African American community, on the Latino community as they have on the African American community. And there is a raging debate among activists and progressive activists in the black community about the relationship between public schools and charter schools. I know I have this debate on a regular basis with my good friend and colleague Earl Lewis, and who has a different perspective on this. I'm just wondering how that is playing out in central Brooklyn in terms of the impact on young people being able to get the best education possible to get out of poverty.
You said, Errol, for those of you who know, Errol and I were partners in starting the Central Brooklyn Federal Credit Union back in the early 90s, and we diverge on a lot of political issues. But I would say that it's very complicated, because when you talk about charter schools and charter schools and the role they're playing, we see a very staunch and aggressive progressive movement fighting back against the charter movement, and it's oftentimes predominantly white-led, and it becomes a very difficult conversation to have in the black community. And as someone who's got 2 children who've gone through the public school system, at the end of the day, you walk out your door and you just want. I think it does. Your interests don't become any more selfish than they do when you talk about your children. And so all the talk about public schools, charters, it all just washes away. And you just want a safe harbor for your child. You want a place that you know will give them some opportunities. And all of your political considerations just sort of wash away. And that's where we are in Central Brooklyn. We did a study not too long ago of Community Board District 16, which was failing for a long time, still is to some extent, still is to a large extent, was overwhelmingly black and Latino, overwhelmingly free and reduced cost lunch, and very, in a very stealth way over the past 10 years, now charter schools there are as many children in charter schools in Community School District 16 as there are in traditional public schools. And it happened, and I mean, I don't want to pat ourselves on the back too much, but no one really raised it until we did very recently. And so it's had a big impact on community and in schools and the kinds of changes that we're able to make and the kinds of parent-led movements that we see in schools. Because whereas you see some movement in traditional public schools with parents leading the fight, parents are in many ways sort of neutralized in charter schools and are not really encouraged to be at the forefront of things. So I think, again, it's a very difficult issue to talk about. I mean, my father, my aunts and uncles were all in the public school system. I went to a public school before I went to a private school for high school. My children as well. But, you know, there have been moments where I've had to consider charter schools. And so if I'm doing that with my politics, imagine folks who, you know, who are not thinking along that level, you know, and that's my biggest critique of people who are fighting charter schools, that they're not sensitive enough to what black families are experiencing on the ground when it comes to the choices and the options. And we're going to need to somehow take it back, right? I don't believe that we are best served by the proliferation of charter schools in Central Brooklyn on a lot of different levels, and for the most part, they're not performing much better than the traditional public schools. But it's a very difficult conversation to have.
And can I just get back off of that? Because I live in Harlem, and it's and I always tell people the statistic: there are more children in Harlem of the middle school age in charter schools than public schools. Yes. And so the conversation has to change. Like you can't just say charter schools are bad or district schools. We got to have a real conversation about education in the black community, and particularly in communities like Harlem and Central Brooklyn.
Yeah, and it needs to get back to some of those larger issues we're talking about, like the privatization of our communities. I mean, I think that it's not unrelated to what we see as far as gentrification and the loss of power to bigger corporate forces.
But there was a time when there were organizations in our community that recognized that not everybody was as politically aware or involved. And they had a responsibility to do that level of thinking and then to try to activate a more active participation amongst parents and other people. All such organizations existing now that view our job as being able to have a level that sees stuff that other people might not see, warn them about it, and get them active so that they are not as easily beguiled in some of these programs. For example, does the Urban League do that anymore? Does the NAACP do that anymore? Does CORE do that anymore? Does CSS do that? And are these communities aware that they need to give up at a different level due to the rapid pace with which these changes are being offered as temptations to self-destruction of their various communities?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Well, I want an answer to that question.
Dave, you want to?
Well, no, I think we've lost. It's been one of the great problems of how I brought up my grandfather. We don't have channels of information going necessarily into the heartland of the community anymore. We had BLS and LIB, which led part to David's victory. They blew that up in many respects, I think consciously. The fight, obviously, many of you may remember that Bill Tatum almost was able to take over the New York Post. And that was destroyed. Everyone laughed and giggled. And that had a determined and major impact. But finding manners of communication into the core constituency has become one of the great problems going forward. my grandfather was right. You've got to almost go block by block, but you have to have credible vehicles to do that. I think it's one of the great problems we're up against. One of the reasons we went along with Kim and the color line, we're desperately struggling to find new ways of communicating to another generation, not only of people in communities, but of the emerging young people going forward. But I think this is nationwide.
And that connection, as you were mentioning the radio stations, and I remember in the late 70s when I was living in Philadelphia, and WDAS was the big African-American station there that really was instrumental in defeating Frank Rizzo when he was the Gestapo mayor of Philadelphia, and really mobilizing the African-American community. And of course, WDAS eventually got bought out by a Clear Channel, and so many of the black radio and television stations across the country have been, and there was the famous photo, I'll never forget, of the SCLC in Atlanta. Was on the headquarters was on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and up on the second floor was WEVD Radio, which was the first black-owned radio station in the United States. And the disc jockeys used to say that whenever Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to get out a message to the black community of Atlanta, he would take a broomstick and bang on the ceiling. And then the disc jockey who was on the station at the time said, "We have an important message from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr." And then he'd lower the microphone down outside the window to Martin Luther King. He'd get on and make his press statement on black radio. That was how close the relationship was between the black radio stations and the civil rights movement. And of course now they've all been bought out, and now it's Black Appeal Radio, but it's no longer Black-owned radio, and it no longer has that same commitment to the community that it used to. I wanted to end my last question, then we'll throw it open to the audience, to the panelists on how the immigration has affected the discussion of poverty in America, because we have I was at a panel at the UFT on Monday with Randy Weingarten and Mike Mulgrew, and over the issue of immigration, how the schools and the teachers union are dealing with it. And there was a Muslim high school student from Flushing High School who was talking about the enormous problems that they're having and how they're being treated as a result of all of the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And we had a student from Rutgers University who's the president of the undocumented students of Rutgers, and who was recently, because of her high-profile stance, called in by ICE for an interview, even though she's a DACA student, and how the changing nature of the demographics of the country and of the demographics of poverty in America has affected the discussion of poverty and the potential solutions to poverty in America. I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Juan keeps asking these easy questions. For me, I see it in terms of the continued fracturing of our public conversation and the fracturing of our sense of community. And I think that, for instance, for black folks in a place like Central Brooklyn, when this assault on immigrants and Muslim folks in particular occurred, I think black folks were like, at least they're not coming after me now, and we need to do so much more in terms of our own sort of inner solidarity as black and brown people, and recognizing that when they come for you, they're going to come for me next, and understanding our shared interests. And I think that as someone who works at a grassroots level, it hasn't happened enough with black and brown communities. There's an organization called Baji, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, that is national, but it's also based in Crown Heights. And they have a conversation, a cross-racial conversation about immigration among Africans, among Muslims, among Caribbean folks, that actually is able to bridge some of these divides. And I think that's going to have to happen more. And in a neighborhood like Central Brooklyn, which was so heavily Caribbean, my family's from Jamaica and Guyana, to get to the place where we don't feel immediately under assault when there's a federal assault against immigration, something's terribly wrong. We should be feeling that viscerally. We should be on the front lines, and the fact that we're not in the numbers where we should be is a real problem.
And my response to it has to do with the fact that people make it appear that it matters that there is a boundary between United States citizens, Canadians, and Mexicans, and make that feel like it's a real big thing, when at the same time they are engaged in globalization with respect to trade, economic development, and advantages, etc. So they make me think that the boundary down there matters, while they make their millions on stuff that has no boundaries other than rapid communication, rapid financial transactions, etc. So when people start having me look at this, when that's the problem, I know I'm in real trouble. So the reality is that right now, I'm grateful for Thomas Friedman's book on Thank You for Being Late, in which he says, listen, technology is growing at such a rate, and globalization is moving, and climate change is happening, that ideological boundaries and geographical boundaries are basically secondary to most of the problems that matter to us. So why don't I just say that a Roman Catholic priest I heard once say, one of the most damaging of lies is the misstatement of the problem. So if they tell me this is the problem, that's a problem, then that's a really bad thing. What we ought to recognize is that if we're going to survive as a civilization, eventually even ideological, boundary, class differences will be secondary to our working on problems that we work on together. So for me, I would say the immigration issue is one of the demonic devices being used by evil people today.
And it's one of the symptoms of severe economic distress and insecurity that people feel across the country, and it's what Trump has exploited and his brand of populism has exploited. It's this idea that it's a zero-sum game, right? And because I'm not doing well, or because I'm insecure, then it must be that Mexican over there that's taking my job, or it must be that Arab over there who's taking my job. And it's the othering of everyone else beyond us that we have to struggle against.
I was at a breakfast this morning with the Harlem Chamber of Commerce, and we were talking about Harlem Week. And I thought it was important that the theme this year is going to be immigration. And it was just wonderful to see the black community embracing their immigrant past. And there was, they've been to Cuba a couple times, and they're trying to figure out how to bring the new Congressman Espaillat, the Dominican Republic, into what they're doing, and vice versa. So I'm optimistic on that front, more than I am on some of the other things we talked about, because I think, again, people are seeing that we're in this together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and increasingly, obviously, as Mark is saying, even in the African American community, the level of immigration is astounding. Whether it's Somalis or Sudanese or Nigerians or Haitians, or that it is a central issue even within the African American community, not just with the others, the other nationalities as well. I want to end my questioning and open it up to questions from the audience, to the panelists, and hopefully questions, not long statements, and so that they can respond to some of your concerns, but maybe on something that I haven't touched on. Anyone like to begin? Yes.
I've thought of militarism often, and when I contrast what's happening now with what happened when I was in college and we had. When I think of militarism and I think of our engagement in military matters, and I draw the contrast between what's going on now and what happened when I was in college, when there was a big movement against the Vietnam War. I think one of the distinctions that comes is the abolition or the removal of the universal draft. And I often wonder, and I know that Congressman Rangel did raise it at some point, which is that it seems to me that as long as the people who are fighting our wars are people who often enter the military because they see it as their only alternative to living in poverty or being jobless or being without skills, as long as that's who makes up the military, I think that there's very little concern among the rest of the population about what's likely to happen if we get engaged in some kind of a military confrontation. What do you think about that? And how likely is that? I mean, I think it would be a highly unpopular thing to propose, and it probably has no legs. But I often wonder if people wouldn't be more invested in looking at how we decide to enter military conflicts if their children were at risk or their loved ones were at risk, and it wasn't other people's kids who were going to fight those wars.
Mm-hmm. Anyone? And I will add that Charlie Rangel repeatedly insisted that the country had to go back to a draft and to in essence a volunteer army, because precisely for that reason, that instead of having one person go to Iraq 5 times, you'd have 5 people go to Iraq each one time, and that would spread the pain and the awareness of what was going on to many more Americans. But anyone else want to tackle that?
I just don't know how you do that without jobs, right? Like, so and that sounds simplistic, but people, like I said, in the situation I was in, join the military because they have nothing else. So a lot of times. So I don't know if the draft is going to even that out, that the people that are going in. And I also think it's the people that join the military are just poor people across the board, I don't see how just instituting the draft is going to change that if there's not opportunities for these people that are in these various communities. And it's not just people in poor city, people in those poor communities in the city. It's the same thing, when I was in the military. That was how I met people from places like Nebraska and those places. So I don't know how just putting in the draft changes that situation that we're all living in, that economic disparity, So.
Well, if we did do that, if we did the draft, it seems it must be linked with community service opportunities, because Dr. King's effort was trying to keep people, to actually bring their draft cards. If it's a democratization of risk for all of our citizens, that's positive. But opportunity for non-militaristic and non-violent means must be a part of any arrangement. Because if that option is not there, the impulse towards conscientious objection is still got to be on the table. So I do think we need to give more attention to community service corps and opportunities so that the war is not the only opportunity to get out of poverty. That's got to be eliminated, but that's my sense on that.
Anyone else have a question? Yes, back there.
Yes, my name is Mark Hannay. I wanted to respond a little bit to, I think, something you said, Reverend Forbes, and Mark, you touched on it some, and that is sort of the way the super rich oligarchy, if you will, has grabbed control of our political structures. And the change that has happened in New York City government over the last couple of decades, where we actually see a lot more community-based people in government, and one could conceivably argue that the only way that we have the current mayor that we have is because we have a public financing system for elections in this city, and a public matching systems where small donors are able to contribute to the political process and are matched by public funds, and that's been a fundamental transformation. So I just wanted some comment on that, because it isn't just that we New Yorkers are special, although we may be, but we also have a system that encourages a different outcome than normal.
Yes. Well, I can quickly say to get as much money out of politics as possible is likely to be good for us all, and to celebrate evidences that in New York we're making progress and hope that the rest of the nation will catch up. However, the trend is the other direction at the present time.
Anyone else? Okay. Yes?
Race is the enduring problem in this country, and it divides us all. And as you all said, it's very difficult to have that conversation between the races. The white experience is not built around empathy, and it is not built around considering the experiences of people that are different. And when I saw the group in Washington, D.C. organizing about the missing women, and there wasn't one white face there, I felt that the white obligation really is to step up and support all those movements and all those demonstrations, and there need to be more white faces there, and that's our obligation.
Okay. I don't think there's a question behind that. Over here. Yes?
Thank you, guys. A lot of the demonstrations that I've seen post-election are a lot of protests, movements, and a lot of the times it doesn't seem like, especially lately, those protests really get much accomplished. They bring people together, but in terms of tangible change, and in addition to those demonstrations, I was wondering if in your guys' work you've come across really innovative ideas that are different than that, or that use that as a part but incorporate other ways of activism that you could share with us to inspire us in this kind of depressing time. Thank you.
Anyone?
Well, let me just say that as an organizer, that is something it's a narrative I fight against a lot. This idea that mobilizations and these demonstrations, that they don't have an impact. And not only do they have an impact, but the impact is oftentimes somewhat invisible. So, for instance, you take the climate march that just occurred. It was so successful in moving so many what were before sort of liberal or middle road elements in labor, corporate, government, moving them further towards the left, or just further towards an acceptance that this is an emergency, and this is something that we have to do. And that was pulled off by the fact that 200,000 people showed up on that day, and there was an umbrella that was created that fit a lot of different people under it. And so, the conversation around climate will never be the same in some respects. And same when it comes to, women, when it comes to the March on Washington back in '63, it changes conversations, it changes the narrative, it changes the way we look at issues in a way that it in many ways can't be measured. And so I'm a big fan of mass mobilizations, and it's similar to voting. It's easy to sort of sit out of it and to say and to have a critique of it and to say I'm not going to matter. But indeed, every person does matter, and you can have a huge impact not only on this country but on the global conversation as well.
Let me say, there ought to be marching, because we need to march. We need to march to say that we're not the only crazy people. We need to march to say that we're not alone in this. We need to march and say, I got to do something.
Yep.
But there must also be the development of after-march action. Mm-hmm. And it's got to be a popular effort to say, everybody that's marching, the day after the march, you got to do something. First of all, to be able to celebrate small things. Because if you stay active in small things, you are more likely to respond when a major action is proposed. So, for example, if you come back from the march, take something from this list. Random acts of kindness. I went to the march yesterday. Do something today. Adopt a family, a leg up ministry, domestic Marshall Plan effort, a tax abatement program, technological preparedness program, state local poverty audit, poor people's hotline emergency volunteer, news referrals. All I do is I go around, I see a need, I can't do anything about it, but I can refer it to somebody. So basically, I'm just saying that we must not despise the day of small things, but something got to happen every day. And we need to have our antennas out for when there's a call for an action that can have more immediate demonstration of its effective impact, that kind of thing. But I agree, just marching is not quite enough. March, and then the day after the march, some kind of action.
And let me just say that, you have to see a march as part of a continuum of actions. And, I think that one of the beauties of march is that when you have a mass mobilization, or even have smaller formations, you always see an uptick in activism, of people joining organizations, of being a part of something, of having their political awareness be expanded. But yes, if you see it as like that is your civic duty to simply go to a march, then you're not understanding the role that is. It's not an end, but it's a means towards something greater.
I'd like to add something on this too, because I'm actually just finished a book that I think responds to some of the questions of what is actually happening, and I may as well put a plug in for it. It comes out in September. It's called Reclaiming Gotham, Bill de Blasio and the Fight to End America's Tale of Two Cities. And it looks at these movements that have been developing over the last decade or so across the country. And actually, some people say, well, the Occupy movement sort of dissipated after a year. It didn't dissipate. It spread. For instance, the Fight for 15. The Fight for 15 did not develop out of nothing. The Social Service Employees Union hired hundreds of young organizers to go all around the country and build Fight for 15 movements. Mm-hmm. A whole portion of the people they recruited as their organizers have come out of the Occupy movement. The climate change activists, a lot of them were part of the Occupy movement. And what started happening 10 or 15 years ago is that lots of people started running for political office, these activists. And for instance, I tell the story of a young Austin City Councilman, Gregorio Casar, who was 16 years old in 2006, participated with his parents in the immigrant rights protests of 2006. Then, a couple of years ago, he was elected to the Austin, Texas City Council, the youngest person that was elected at the age of 25 to be on the Austin City Council, has become like a rising star in Austin. They in turn got a new sheriff elected in Austin, Texas, who is now being attacked by the governor for daring to promote sanctuary cities. And last week, Gregorio Casar was arrested at the state capitol, challenging the Texas state legislature, which just outlawed sanctuary cities throughout Texas. No city in Texas is now allowed to be a sanctuary city, or their elected officials will be arrested. Right? And yet Gregorio Casar immediately got arrested as the law was being passed, and immediately went to court to challenge it. So we're seeing throughout the country these young people running for office and then developing new approaches to governance. In fact, I believe that the cities are our last hope in this country. They are more diverse. They are more vibrant for their willingness to stand up to the federal government. So I think there's a lot of hope. And most of these people came out of protest movements. They came out of social movements, and now they are in elected office. Ras Baraka in Newark. Chakwa Lumumba, you all remember a few years ago, Chakwa Lumumba, former leader of the Republic of New Africa, was elected the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. He tragically died of a heart attack in less than a year, but last week his son ran for office again and won the Democratic primary. Will now be Chakwa Antan Lumumba will now become the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, following in his father's footsteps. So there's, the young people are still engaged in struggle. It's just that sometimes we don't see it because there's all of these things happening. We don't see it. There is a national movement around the country
and just
for a better world.
So just to piggyback off what Juan said, I see activism, because I've been in just about every rally in this city the last 10, 15 years. But one of the things I see that's different now is that activists actually come up to me afterwards and say, okay, how do we turn this into policy? I had a meeting 2 weeks ago at our union headquarters with national leaders of Black Lives Matter, and what they were doing was like, how do we turn this into policy? The other thing, I ran for office earlier this year, but one of the things I did was I met with people in the community, and on the issue of policing, I asked young people, what are the issues you have with policing? Like, what is something practical that we can do? And one of the things that came out of that meeting, they were saying, it would be nice if the police came, or when they went through the academy spent some time in the community and got to know people. If people go out and talk, got a bunch of call from activists that they're not going because that's not the bill they wanted. Now, these people, if you would have talked to them a year ago, because we've been having trainings and education on what we really want in a piece of legislation, and they didn't go. They refused to go. And then they called me up and they said, do you know some people can teach us how to write legislation? Like, how does that process work? So activists are starting to understand that activism is not enough, and it's up to people like us to teach them that this is how you turn it into policy.
And can I just say one last thing, I don't know last thing, but one thing about activism and just drawing a line that is, for instance, when you see the change around the conversation around stop and frisk and broken windows policing, a lot of people think that that's sort of just sprung up overnight. I mean, that has been the result of decades and generations worth of agitation around police brutality is finally not only sort of gained some acceptance here in New York City, but really across the country. And when you see the fact that the movement for Black Lives, again, has changed this conversation with a hashtag in many ways, has helped crystallize the fact that, yes, Black lives actually are as important as others. Again, that you can draw straight lines from that to movements that were happening 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago.
Well, I think we need to close. I think we're supposed to end at 8 o'clock, and I just want to thank Reverend Dr. James Forbes, Marvin Holland, Mark Winston Griffith, and I want to leave you with this thought, because I grew up in New York City. The Speaker of the New York City Council put together a commission with the former chief judge, and then suddenly, for the first time that I can remember, there's actually a conversation about closing Rikers Island. This is an enormous change. And when she first appointed that commission, I said, no, this will never happen. But if you read that commission report, it is really an excellent, excellent analysis of what mass incarceration policy has done in New York City and why Rikers Island needs to be closed. And it was authored by the former chief judge of New York State, which is an enormous accomplishment. And if it happens, it will be a huge, huge progress in the city of New York. So I want to thank you all for being with us, and thank the audience, and thanks CSS for putting this together.
You're having conversations with Errol?
Thank you for shepherding us through all.
Thank you. It's terrific.
Oh, trust me, you thank you, brother. Things up well.
Well, I tried pressing it but yeah, this one worked. But that's why at the beginning I was like confused because for some reason it didn't seem like it was working for me. It was from the front desk. Yeah, this is it's okay. It's good you guys had these, but that's why like at first I like hesitated.